since you're all running on tight sessions, we'll just jump right into the book, which is a very interesting and fascinating exploration of a particular moment in Indian political and economic thought, the late 1950s and 1960s, which is not quite discussed enough in our intellectual history. So I'll begin by asking you that the origins of the Swatantra party as a political party, as often happens, begins in a set of debates, exchanges, discussions, magazines, periodicals, ideas being exchanged. And at the center of this is individual called Lotwala and what they establish, And the interesting thing is that many of these people involved in these debates in the 50s and 60s are, as you say, stalwarts of the anti-colonial freedom movement, and also engage deeply with international communism, the international left. And one conclusion that they all come to is that there is a problem with state-led, centralized, top-down economic modeling, economic planning, and generally the control of the state over wide domains of social and economic life, which was the Nehruvian consensus, so to say. And these people include, for example, M.P.T. Acharya, who is an anarchist. And for a long while, he is supported by Lotwala before they have a falling out. So my first question is that in the 50s and 60s, you had a set of people who arrived at the conclusion that the state is a problem, but arrived at very different solutions to the problem. On the one hand, you had the anarchists, Indian anarchists, who saw the answer in decentralization, but along with a certain kind of coordination, equality, and so on. On the other hand, you had what became the party, which saw the answer as being more of a small c conservatism. So why was that, and what led to these very interesting overlaps and then departures?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. It's indicative of how carefully I think Gautam has read this book. It's a real privilege to be in conversation with him. So, just briefly, since many people may not know what the Swatantra Party was, it's essentially what became the largest opposition party in India for a brief period in the 1960s, right, when it won 44 seats in the Lok Sabha and formed the key opposition in 3 states, which were Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. But as I argue in the book, the movement is actually, even if the vote banks come from some states like that, movement is driven by ideas that are germinating from communities in the west and the south of India, right, which are areas traditionally of long-distance overseas trade, right, bordered by large bodies of water. They are, during the colonial era, large swaths of these areas are settled under Rayatwari settlement rather than Mahalwari or Zamindari, etc. And so Gautam asks a very important question about the intellectual milieu of the group of people who are responsible for bringing the discourse of free economy against the rhetoric of socialist planned economy, right? You have to understand the other to understand what exactly free economy is, because it's constructed oppositionally. And that is taking place in, the sort of origin story is in this institute called the Libertarian Social Institute in Bombay, run by a remarkable person named Ranchod Das Lotwala, actually ideated by Ranchod Das Lotwala, but run by his kind of extraordinary daughter, Kusum Lotwala. Right? And the family is one that has financed all kinds of political activities, movements for social reform. They have been involved, Lotwala was the patron not just of Acharya, but of S.A. Dange earlier in his life. But he is somebody who kind of, and this is kind of at the heart of the book, is informal economic thinkers, right? Like politicians and publicists who don't publish canonical theories, but they're very influential in our day-to-day lives, in that those are the people whose economic rhetoric that we're reading, right? We're reading our journalists and listening to our politicians, rather than necessarily reading economic textbooks or theories that are showing up in journals, right? So the Lotwalas, or Ranchod Das Lotwala specifically, was very interested in various forms of anti-imperial politics, which included anarchist politics and the politics of the left. But as things become more concrete, right, and you move from kind of aspiration of what a free India should look like, right, to what it is becoming, and as figures like Lotwala and their Lotwala is a Gujarati mill owner, okay, so as he kind of encounters in his milieu people who are dealing with certain kinds of regulations that are introduced by the Nehruvian state, right, permits for business, licensing of foreign exchange, etc., right, and it's associated with the production of a dominant economic imaginary, they start to kind of diverge with some of the more progressive elements that they have supported in the past, right. And there's also, I think, a genealogical a point for many of these people, which is after the purges by Stalin of the Trotskyists in the interwar period, a number of people who are very sympathetic to communism and anarchism start to drift rightwards. And this is a very powerful intellectual phenomenon, not just in India, right, but in various parts of the Western world, including the United States. Right? So this is the context in which such a thing kind of takes place. Somebody like Acharya has always been a revolutionary, right? And somebody like Lotwala has always been a financier of revolutionaries with some ideas of his own. And there's a distinction there that needs to be drawn.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's the Libertarian Institute because Acharya always called himself a libertarian, except that you had libertarian anarchism, and then you had the libertarianism of the institute. And of course, a mill owner, you think of Engels and that whole relationship. So it is interesting how that plays out. So I guess like leading on from that.
Just one thing, not every mill owner is Engels. That's what I'm trying to show, clearly. Right?
As we've seen, yeah.
Right.
So I think the leading on from that, so as these intellectual currents began to coalesce into a political formation that is in many ways led by Rajagopalachari, who was of course a Congress rebel. It's what I found interesting was that in your book you talk about how the focus of their critique is the statist vision of Nehru's Congress, which is to me interesting because up until then the dominant opposition, both in the level of many states and at the center, was the Communist Party. They were the largest opposition party, and it seems to me that if you're seeking to be the opposition, you would also want to displace the existing opposition and take their place. So I was struck by how it seemed that for these thinkers and political figures, how their imagination was dominated by the Congress and not by the Communist Party or the party formally in place.
No, again, that's a really thoughtful question. And one of the things that I say is that there are many different ideas of free economy that germinate, right, in parts of southern and western India, including your Charatar Patidars and Amul. You have N.G. Ranga, who's the peasant leader from northern Sarkar's region, and he has a kind of agrarian vision about of global system for coordination of agricultural prices based on he calls the freedom-loving small land-owning peasant, and then you have this a kind of capitalist Minu Masani's view of free trade for the world, which is somewhat at odds with that. But what they share in common is what I have referred to as anti-communism. Right? But that is not anti-communism against the Congress Party. There is a brand of anti-communism, right, which is exemplified in the Friedrich von Hayek type of road to serfdom argument, right, which is that the moment the state decides that they're going to nationalize one industry or they're going to start running a public sector enterprise within the framework of a mixed economy, which is what India was, right? The moment that you decide to pursue some kind of welfare subsidy or you bring in some kind of price control, that will necessarily lead to the road to serfdom, right? And that's a very powerful rhetorical tool. And today it may strike us as bizarre or berserk, right? But it is something that in the context of the Cold War and in the context of what is taking place globally in the 50s and 1960s, it has some more takers. Right? And why is this? Why do they worry less about the communists? A couple of reasons. The first is somebody like Rajagopalachari, who is the C. Rajagopalachari, who coins the term permit, license, Raj, etc. He has been he has been the chief minister, probably the strongest anti-communist, including against the Communist Party in India of his time. I would say one of them. Rajgopalachari, when he shows up and becomes premier of or chief minister of Madras in 1952, the first thing he says when he comes to the assembly is, to the communists, I am your enemy number one. Okay, but he then says, by the time he finishes up with Parliament, he realizes that actually P. Ramurthy and all of these guys sitting in Tamil Nadu Communist Party are actually fairly benign, much less of a threat than communists in Kerala, which I've kind of written about elsewhere, and in West Bengal, etc. And of course, there's a very powerful communist movement in Bombay and this sort of thing. But what ends up happening is that ultimately, if you are to think about who is the big name in town, right? In the context of what Rajni Kothari called one-party dominance, right? When you have a party of consensus that is an umbrella party like the Congress, which accommodates some diversity within it, but then around that you have these parties of pressure, which don't really have a chance of dislodging the Congress, but they kind of try to adjust the center of gravity. They decide it's better kind of put their resources towards this thing. And the second point is, Swatantra Party is founded in 1959. Guess what happens to the Kerala government in 1959? It is, Article 356 is, if I'm not mistaken, he's the constitutional expert, is invoked, and EMS Namboodiripat's government is taken out of it. So they're not that worried. And that is also why, right, there are some of the more, there are a couple of people who are running some CIA-funded organizations like Congress of Cultural Freedom. Those of you who were here yesterday may have heard Akshaya Mukul talk so eloquently about it. The American ambassadors and the CIA folks, CIA-aligned folks, are really not that interested in the Swatantra people, because a lot of people like to think, aha, gotcha, this is a CIA conspiracy. Because they consider that Nehru to be the last so-called liberal hope in Asia, right? And they're much more focused on what's going on in Southeast Asia and in China. Southeast Asia is where they feel they can win the battles, right? And they help pursue these sort of brutal massacres in the 1960s in Indonesia, etc. So that's kind of where the eggs are put in the Congress basket in terms of mobilizing, and pursuing their energies.
Yeah, and even in the 52 election in Madras, actually, the communists emerged as, they should have had the first shot at forming the government, but then again, the governor did. From the beginning, we've had the governor intervening and all of that. So yeah, that was happening from the beginning. I think again, leading on from that, the intellectual currents you talk about are very interesting because, again, what ultimately coalesces into the party is influenced by a whole range of intellectual traditions. So we talk about how on the one hand, there is a strand of Hindu revivalism, and Munshi, is an important figure there. But it's not the sole guiding feature of this formation. They engage with the Mont Pelerin society. So neoliberalism, as it is emerging or becoming stronger in the West, and they read texts by Mises and those figures. They are called to London and were impressed by the Indian neoliberal emerging intellectual tradition. At the same time, they understand that in a country like India, there has to be a certain need for intervention that may not be there in the West. You talk about how the peasant proprietor, who is not the zamindar, but is like a small landholding farmer, is again at the center of the imagination of many of these people. The urban trading individual is also at the center of their imagination. So what you have then is this amalgamation of a dash of religion, a dash of intervention, and a lot of what we understand as neoliberal theory. So my question then is that do you think that this, I guess two questions, two connected questions. One is that is this a distinct moment in Indian intellectual history which has not been repeated since? So the present intellectual formations on the right, do you think there is a thread that binds, or is it a totally distinct thing now? And do you think that this moment actually, you can call it as a distinct Indian conservative ideology or philosophy, that was there enough coherence, internal coherence, to make it a distinct Indian contribution to the history of right-wing intellectual thought, so to say?
So thank you so much. So yeah, there are varying different visions that come together under the banner of Swatantra, right? And like any party, you're going to have some kind of diversity. But what I would suggest is, even still, there is a lowest common denominator, right? Which I think is distinctive, which is decentralization of economic activity, right? The pursuit of private, or unfettered private economic activity, this kind of anti-communism in their rhetoric, and the defense of private property, right? And I talk about in the book about how they're against the 17th Amendment. They help bring the bank nationalization case. So they're involved also with the Privy Purses case challenge, right? These are very important cases in the constitutional kind of history of India. And they are there kind of defending the right to property, hiring Nani Palkiwala, this sort of thing as well, right? So, so I think that is something that is, in a sense, you can ascribe some coherence. But also what I'm in part trying to do in this book is to tell you that the history of economic thought is not just the history of economists, right? And that there are loose, informal, thoughtful, right? But not necessarily conceptually as sophisticated people, like your, canonical political theorists, or even, some of our remarkable Indian intellectuals like Ambedkar, right? We don't have that, and yet you can still find something. And I think that it's more than you would find in terms of intellectual coherence, in the sort of Hindu right today. At the same time, I think with respect to, there's always a question, right? Does economic conservative necessarily mean religious conservative in the Indian context, given, Hindu caste society, sort of Brahmin-Banyan nexus, et cetera, et cetera. And what I would say to that is that, yes, Swatantra Party is still dominantly kind of Hindu, and there is a kind of conservatism. Somebody like Rajgopalachari is against the Hindu Succession Act, and the Kalki magazine runs a newspaper cartoon, right, which I unfortunately wasn't able to include, called Urumai Por, which is a war of rights, where a woman is being pulled on one side by her husband, okay, on the other side by her brother. Right? Now, in other words, if you give a woman, access to half the rights of property that her brother has, then, she will not be dutiful to the husband. So there is certainly that dimension of it. K.M. Munshi, who is a member of Swatantra Party, is actually there at the first meeting of the VHP, right? He is, instrumental in the destruction of the mosque in Somnath, and then the reconstruction of the Somnath temple. So all that is there, but I would argue, those kinds of elements are also there in the Congress, right? The Congress right. And they are, broadly in the Nehruvian era, one could make an argument that relative to today, they were kept in check in a certain fashion, right? Because of the way in which the dominant power structure after the death of Patel operated. Was this distinctive and of its moment? And yes, and I would say that probably the major reason why overt majoritarianism is killed by, or is skewed by Swatantra, is because of the strong connection of figures like Masani, Ranga, Rajgopalachari, to Mahatma Gandhi, and the particular brand of politics he pursued of, which was religious, but it was about university and diversity, right? We think about the Khilafat movement, his fast, and the tremendous work that he did during partition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they're held together by that, and a kind of, Gandhian set of ideas. I think Rajgopalachari himself is someone who actually takes minority rights seriously. Right? For example, in his, Manoj is sitting in the audience, so he's discussed, with respect to MC Raja and temple entry, he's somebody who was interested in pursuing that, of course, although very cautious, right? And he didn't go as far as a lot of other people would have wanted him. There is that. There is a way in which somebody like Rajgopalachari is also very sensitive to the kind of Hindu-Muslim tensions, and he's somebody who says, look, India should give up its claims to Kashmir because that would reduce enmity between the two countries, right? He formulates the CR plan in the 1940s, which you're familiar with. He also writes to the editor of the organizer, K.R. Malkani, co-founder of the Bharatiya Janasangh, that look, you really ought to stop, right, running articles about kings, Muslim kings who are, as tyrants, because it does nothing but create enmity in our society, right? So, you have as a commitment, he went farther than I think certain others who are in the Congress in that respect. And I think that is due to, being a part of the, Gandhian kind of nationalist movement, which of course is not perfect, but it has certain kinds of appealing aspects. Now, has that gone away today? Do we still have something like that? Well, I would argue that you still have people who I think, maybe we be willing to countenance ethno-majoritarianism, but that there are people who can be, who can be co-opted away as well. I think there are people who are, purely interested in the kind of economic questions, right? I mean, to quote Deng Xiaoping, I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse, right? So there are people like that. And I think that those people can, hopefully be persuaded as well. So.
No, I think that we have done exactly 20 minutes. This is a good time to open it up for the last 1/3 of this and for questions. So, yeah.
Hi, absolutely fascinating book. Congratulations. Do you think that the decline of Swatantra Party, eventual decline of the Swatantra Party, is explained in part by the fact that the free market agenda cannot be at the center stage of a political movement, and that you have to combine it necessarily with something else, right? That's probably how libertarian politics has advanced elsewhere as well, and that was partly the failure of the Swatantra Party, and that led to its eventual decline.
Yeah. No, so thank you. That's a really great question. And I think it's one of the things that I discuss in the book is about how Swatantra finds it profoundly challenging to mobilize people based on an ideology that is purely around economic interests and trying to eschew consciously issues of caste, religion. Of course, that means that in a way, by not talking about it, you're making a statement in a different way, right? So that's something like, for example, they appeal to the so-called middle-class citizen. But there's never any consensus about who this middle-class citizen is. In fact, in the cartoon literature, that middle-class literature is R.K. Lakshman's Common Man, which has been knocked off by these Swatantra figures, right? R.K. Lakshman's Common Man is common to nobody. He falls in the income of nobody's income distribution. And also, by the way, the common man is always a man. I've spent probably too much time looking at Swatantra Party pamphlets. I haven't found a single woman in the visual literature. There's a very powerful woman who was involved in it called Maharani Gayatri Devi, right? But even in that particular case, when she wins the election, she says allegedly the most one-sided contest in the history of democracy, but not particularly democratic, because after she wins, she says, look, this is all thanks to my husband and the great respect the subjects have for him. She goes and when she campaigns, she says, oh, please vote for me. She says, of course, aren't we your subjects? So democratic conscience is not quite necessarily like percolated in that instance. So in other words, you can get votes based on your feudal relationships. But when you're trying to mobilize like a figure like Minu Masani is in Bombay with his pamphlet literature and this sort of thing, you can get some amount of engagement, right? But it's again very limited. And your point about, in the West, the way, even in the West, right, people like Milton Friedman, Hayek and all that find all of this extremely challenging in terms of trying to get political capture. What helps them, and Melinda Cooper, if you haven't read this book, it's a phenomenal book. It's called Family Values Between Neoliberalism and the New Social Conservatism. It's about the deal that is struck by these like social and religious conservatives and free market thinkers, right? And the way in which that coalition kinds of comes together to get money, right? Which is why your Reagan says big government is the problem, but then he's also like hanging out with Billy Graham and addressing the 500 Club, which is a very bizarre television experience, which you should see just for the kind of for an experience. I'll kind of leave it at that. But having said that, okay, I think India of 1960s is different from India of 2010s, right? And so you do have the rise of various different kinds of economic interests who are not there in the 60s, who I would argue, who some of whom have made their peace or their allegiance to the sort of ruling party, but who I would suggest offer the ranks of the so-called middle classes that are actually elite in a sense, and English speaking or dominant landowning castes in rural areas. I think those ranks who have transitioned to kind of new forms of capitalist activity, that constituency actually I would argue has increased, right?
Hi, yeah. So I am Ajay. I have this question. In your opinion, what lesson can contemporary politics and economic movement draw from the experience of Swatantra in India?
Yeah, sure, we'll collect it here.
Hi, yeah, very nice discussion. I'm Gopal Krishna. India's history can be demarcated pre-emergency, post-emergency. Before emergency, Swatantra Party was at its peak. Pilu Modi, we have been reading about him. He was a great intellectual, but at the same time he had a great sense of humor. And very sarcastically, when Indira Gandhi was talking about CA and all, he came to the parliament with a tag, I am CA agent, do like that. So what I'm trying to say is, after emergency, all the 5 parties joined. So in that conglomeration, Swatantra party lost its original stature. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first, if that's all right. I think that I would disagree a little bit. I would say that actually Swatantra Party was profoundly affected by the split in the Congress Party, right? In the Congress R and Congress O, which, you know, there's a sort of very useful chapter in India after Gandhi about this, right? Congress split. And so what happens, right? Your Congress O, right? The old guard, syndicate, all of these people, they take the vote banks of Swatantra with them, right? Because that seems more viable. The second thing that happens is Rajgopalachari dies, right? Third thing that happens is, you know, Minu Masani, who is your general secretary, right, has a profound problem dealing with inefficiencies because he runs a management consultancy. He founded Tata's Management Trading Center. I mean, I argue that's not the sum total of him. We can't caricature him as purely a big business kind of guy, but that's certainly a part of it. You know, when people don't respond to his instructions, you know, in Rajkot because they're pursuing politics in the way that they should get votes rather than disseminating the pamphlets that he's saying, he gets very angry. He threatens to quit the party some 3-4 times. Okay, so there's also a sort of personalities issue in Swatantra, and all of this takes place well before 1975. In fact, Swatantra, you know, Rump Swatantra or whatever is left of it, merges into that, merges into BKD and such in 74, right? So that's what happens. So with respect to the present, yeah, so I suppose as a historian, I'm kind of allergic to drawing too many lessons for the present, right? Because otherwise it's standing today and looking backwards, whereas what I try to understand is, you know, from that time, if we push forward or look forward, how did things evolve with, you know, out of choice and contingency and this sort of thing, right? Having said that, what are some things that I think are valuable? I think, and I've written a little bit about this, and one thing is, I believe that Swatantra was able to jettison the majority, or at least the overtly majoritarian rhetoric. If you look at the party platform, there is nothing about so-called, you know, whatever, Hindu culture or anything like that. I think the other thing that is valuable about Swatantra and its leaders was that they were heavily invested, right, in what they saw their mission as pedagogues, as pedagogues and in pedagogy, right? So they were, and this is something that it wasn't unique to Swatantra, right? I mean, you know, the Nehruvian state is also immensely pedagogical, and some might even say, you know, well, it was paternalist in certain ways. But it is something that I think as the inheritance of the nationalist movement, the idea is that you have to teach the public. You're enfranchising an electorate that is largely poor and, not literate. So there's also sort of, and has not experienced democracy, right? So we have to explain these things to people. And that role as peer educators, right, is something that has been, with the Swatantra leadership ever since somebody like Minu Masani wrote Our India, which is back when he was more left-leaning, a brilliant illustrated economic geography of India of the 1940s. It sold 2 million copies, right? It is something that is with N.G. Ranga, who is a professor of history and economics at Pachayappa's College in Madras for a time, or Chennai. It is something that is with Rajagopalachari, who is translating physics textbooks, Kimball's physics textbooks. He writes it, he translated Tamil and writes, Tamil Mudiyuma. Is it possible in Tamil? Right? He's somebody who is, he writes a popular education reader called Urukku Nallathu with his protege K. Santanam, who's also very famous in, I suppose, constitutional history of India. K. Santanam, and he writes an educational reader where he says, படிச்ச எவனும் சும்மா இருக்க கூடாது. Anybody who is able to read should not be quiet. He should read the newspaper out to everybody in the village. Okay, so there is that focus on peer education and this sort of thing, which I think is important, and which I think that, there's a very famous line in Sunil Kilnani's Idea of India where he says, by the 70s, Indian democracy becomes about winning elections. I think that spirit is something that, we can take with us valuably today.
Yes, I think that's what we have time for. Thanks so much.